Thank you, and it's great to be here. It's great to be at Quarry Farm, of course, and it's very appropriate too. And I was finishing up my PhD at UConn. I lived in an apartment in Hartford, essentially right around the corner from Mark Twain's house there. So it's a good synchronicity of events. And much as my talk, my work I'm doing in my research on Mark Twain and astronomy is in some ways parallel to my work I did last year on H.P. Lovecraft and astronomy. There's also another kind of interesting parallel. There's not a lot of connections between Lovecraft and Twain, but there is the fact that just like Mark Twain's wife lived here in Elmira, Lovecraft's wife actually lived here in Elmira also. So it's an interesting parallel. If anyone's interested, she lived on 815 John Street, right across from the Clarion Inn, where it is now. Although I don't think it existed in the 1890s. But probably one of the better known quotes by Mark Twain, there are quite a few, is one that he gave to his future biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, and I think it was June 1909. And it was, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt, now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together. They must go out together." And as you can see from this timeline, his prediction, or his hope, I guess, was borne out. The day, April 20th, when Halley's Comet was the closest approach to the sun, the next day Mark Twain died. So again, this is a pretty good guess. And actually, it's even more kind of notable in that April of 1910, even though Halley's Comet had been approaching Earth, it was coming from the opposite side of the sun. So essentially, it had been invisible to Earth. All of a sudden, the comet appears, essentially out of nowhere. And so basically, it seems like the comet shows up and Mark Twain dies. So kind of probably add an extra bit of panache to his a final good bit of publicity for him. And there's also kind of another interesting parallel also. In 1835, when Halley's Comet arrived in that orbit, first, as I mentioned here, it's actually first sighted in August 31st, 1835 at Yale University in New Haven. So, not too far from Hartford, not too far from Ridgefield, so some good connections there. But it's kind of interesting that in 1835, Halley's Comet was not really remarked upon. It wasn't really a big deal. There's not really a lot of publications. It wasn't kind of a point of interest. You can say just like, the infant Sam Clemens, not a lot of interest to the world. In 1910, when Halley's Comet returns, when Mark Twain dies, they are both celebrities. Mark Twain dies in the midst of kind of the biggest, not quite celebration, as we'll say, but the biggest public attention around Halley's Comet, mainly for reasons I'll mention in a few minutes, because people thought it was going to kill everyone on Earth and there's a mass panic. So not quite the positive association. But it's discovered by astronomer E.E. Barnard in 1910, who observes it, or he starts to observe it at Yerkes Observatory. It becomes visible from the Earth only in late April. It passes by Earth on May 6th, so the Earth goes through the tail of Halley's Comet, and it kind of goes off into space again. And the Earth not having come to an end, it's kind of a bit anticlimactic. And actually, it kind of got overshadowed also, because in January of that year, there had been kind of a surprise comet, the Great January Comet, which comes out of nowhere, is actually much brighter than Halley's Comet. And so one of the kind of things that are kind of interesting is when people kind of think back on the 1910 appearance of Halley's Comet, they're actually a lot of times thinking of the January 1910 comet, not Halley's Comet. But of course, this is not the first time Halley's Comet has visited Earth before. There have been several, notable apparitions throughout the millennia. Halley's Comet, returns every 74 to 76 years. It varies a bit because every time it comes into the inner solar system, Jupiter's gravity alters its orbit somewhat, so it's not exactly correct. But, throughout history, to use a phrase, there have been multiple sightings of this comet. Probably most famously, it's in the Bayeux Tapestry of 1066, or showing the events of 1066. Giotto, the Italian painter, in 1301, he paints the Nativity with a comet as a star. Halley's Comet had passed that time. This is part of a tradition that associates Halley's Comet with the Star of Bethlehem. Now, the astronomer whose name is on Halley's Comet, Edmund Halley, he observes a comet passing by in the year 1682. He starts to wonder, whether this had been the same comet that had occurred before in 1607 and before that in 1531, because he sees this pattern. So Halley says, okay, these last three, comets must have been the same one that's, returning. He predicts that this comet is going to return in 1758. When it does, and that's the apparition prior to the 1835 arrival, that's when it becomes named Halley's Comet. And that's when people start looking for kind of other occurrences in the past as well. So in 1758, that's when the first proposals emerge that the comet may have actually been the historical Star of Bethlehem. And this is something you can imagine might be appealing to the euhemeristic, Mark Twain, who had, somewhat dim ideas of organized religion, at least later on in his life. So you can see he might have, he grew up in a time when this was an accepted, or I say a plausible hypothesis for the Star of Bethlehem. However, after the 1835 arrival, this starts to get, revised. It's no longer generally accepted, especially because of the timing. Doesn't exactly, meet up. Now, what's interesting also is that if you do the timing back, the year 530, the comet came by. It's also one of the occurrences where it's not really remarked upon in the historical record. In a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, Hank Morgan is sent back to the year 528. He stays there a decade. Therefore, he would have been present when Halley's Comet returned. It's interesting that, for Mark Twain, who later on really associated himself with Halley's Comet, didn't include, Halley's Comet in his novel. Now, by the time he writes A Connecticut Yankee in 1889, there's this long history of associations of comets with political phenomenon on Earth, in particular with the Civil War, but with the issue of kind of slavery and morality as well. Nat Turner, the slave who leads the infamous insurrection in Virginia in 1831, he sees the solar eclipse of February 12th, 1831 as the sign to start his uprising, kind of the beginning of an association of astronomical phenomenon with political, specifically slavery issues in the United States. That year, there's a major meteor shower, which is very influential to a slave in Richmond at the time named John Jasper, who at the end of the century is going to become one of the leading flat earthers. I'll say he's a big part in my book that's coming out next year, so buy the book and you can read all about him there. As a young man in 1833, Abraham Lincoln sees a very striking apparition of the Leonid meteor shower. He's with some friends. The Leonids that year are so, they're so bright, there's so many of them coming down. There's kind of like a minor panic that this is a sign that the world is going to end. Later on, when the Leonids return during the Civil War, Lincoln talks about how, he's actually reassured because of the fact that the Leonids come back every year, and it's caused by the Earth going through like kind of the old remains of a comet's tail. So there's a comet connection there. He says the fact that you have this meteor shower that comes back every year, that's a sign that, it's a sign of renewal. It's a sign that the Union will persevere, the country will be renewed. So he looks, at this meteor shower not as an apocalyptic event, but as a hopeful one. Another person who saw the Leonids that year in 1833 as a hopeful sign was Harriet Tubman. She writes about that the other slaves she was with thought that this was a sign the world was ending. She didn't. Her fellow, emancipated slave Frederick Douglass, he associated the Leonids with the second coming, I'm not sure if he meant that metaphorically or symbolically, but again, the sense of renewal arriving with them. In 1859, there's a free black physician in the South, Martin Delaney. He starts talking about comets symbolizing the bodies of the escaped slaves, of these comets fleeing from the south. And that's because that year there's an oncoming comet that's approaching the Earth. In July 1860, ahead of the Great Comet, there's slaves in the South who see the meteor showers, assume it's a portent of the coming Civil War, which everyone can kind of assume. When the Great Comet finally starts to emerge, as it's referred to, it starts to become visible in the sky right around the time of the Harper's Ferry raid. So again, a very ominous portent to some. And then by the time the comet of 1860 is kind of extremely visible, it's the election, it's the secession of the southern states that have become. And what's more, not only is there a great comet in 1860 when the secession crisis starts, the next year at the start of the Civil War, the start of armed hostility, there's another great comet that kind of comes in from nowhere, is very visible, and is seen as the symbol of the outbreak of the war itself. So you have these things like fantastic meteor showers, comets that are unpredictable, out of nowhere, extremely bright, all happening around the issues of slavery, the election, the secession, the Civil War. So there really is this giant association in the 1860s, the 1850s, of comets with the political issue of slavery, the perseverance of the country. Now, again, the Civil War ends in 1865. Someone who publishes a very important celestial-based novel at that time, not yet Mark Twain, but Jules Verne, who in 1865 publishes From the Earth to the Moon. In 1870, its sequel, Around the Moon. He follows this up in 1877 with his novel Hector Servadac, which then in the English translation is very helpfully translated as Off on a Comet, which features this fictional comet named Gallia, which has a near impact with the Western Mediterranean. In Verne's novel, there are these, this group of people who are sailing around the Mediterranean on a ship. Their ship gets taken up, onto the comet. As the comet's going around the solar system, they're sailing around this comet, finding islands. In his, view, the comet is this giant, kind of like an ocean with islands on it. They're finding other people who got swept up by the comet. 2 years later, as the comet, comes back to Earth, they take the sails of their boat, make a balloon, and basically, balloon from the comet back to the Earth. Very, kind of loose science fiction, even by Jules Verne's standard. But this has been described by Stephen Baxter, a major science fiction author in the UK. He says this is really the first time in science fiction that there's the idea you can have a community of humans living for a long scale in space on another world. And so again, even kind of more so than his two From the Earth to the Moon novels, this kind of has a big impact on the idea of human colonization, human survivability in space. But another follow-up to From the Earth to the Moon is the serialized novel The Brick Moon by Edward Everett Hale, a Unitarian minister from Boston, a grandnephew of the Revolutionary War hero Nathan Hale, who serves as the chaplain of the U.S. Senate from 1903 until his death. In this serialized novel, the Brick Moon itself is being built as a communications satellite. Again, this is the first appearance in fiction of the idea of the communications satellite. Actually, even the first appearance in nonfiction. It's many decades before this idea gets expounded on. The idea is that the Brick Moon is going to get launched through a water wheel into orbit around the Earth, and then, by tracking where it is, you can, bounce, like light waves off it, or sailors can use it to navigate. Unfortunately, some workers get trapped, inside it. They get flung into space. They're living on the surface of this, brick-made moon. There's a lot of interesting stuff. Like he thinks that because the brick moon is smaller than the Earth, that evolution will proceed faster on the surface. Like moss, very quickly evolves into chickens and geese and stuff, so they can have, meat on the brick moon. It's very, very interesting, very, again, loose science fiction. But again, this is actually not only the first appearance in fiction of a space station. Again, Stephen Baxter said, this is the longest work, either fact or fiction, about a satellite of any sort until the 1950s. And so again, you have these two very prominent works of science fiction in the immediate post-Civil War period that kind of pioneer several ideas, communication satellites, space stations, space colonization, that are very prominent, to us today. And notably, again, The Brick Moon, written by Edward Everett Hale. Twain met Hale in December 1906. They both spoke to the U.S. House of Representatives on copyright issues. Hale himself dies a few months before Twain in 1909. Twain responds by saying, he has the greatest respect for the man, greatest admiration for the work. So it seems likely he probably would have read The Brick Moon. I haven't found a smoking gun yet, but again, Twain definitely was familiar with Hale. He was also familiar with Jules Verne, had a much lower opinion of Verne. I think he called him the French idiot. Basically, I think it's been presumed because Verne had a very, a positive view of technology, really loved technological development. There's also a fact that, Twain's older brother, Orion, had written a novel that was kind of a ripoff of Journey to the Center of the Earth. And I think in his novel, he kind of has people go to the center of the Earth and find that Jules Verne is in hell in the center of the Earth. And, Twain has a murder, a mystery, and a marriage where, Jules Verne is a character in that short story and also is not treated very well. So definitely Twain, familiar with both of these authors, but a much higher opinion of one than the other. Now, another person who, ostensibly is writing nonfiction, but also some entries into fiction at this point, that Twain does have a much better admiration for, is Ignatius Donnelly, who's a very interesting public figure in the U.S. of the late 19th century. He starts his political career in Minnesota as a radical Republican. He's a lieutenant governor. He's in the Minnesota legislature. He's lieutenant governor of the state. He gets elected to Congress in the later stages of the Civil War. A strong advocate for a lot of Reconstruction amendments. He supports education. He supports votes for women. He supports very extensive civil rights for the emancipated slaves, which more than anything else probably costs him his political career. And so he has what we would consider a very progressive, very ahead of his time stance on politics. After he kind of loses political office, he becomes what we might call a conspiracy theorist. And again, probably the greatest conspiracy theorist of the 19th century. In 1882, he publishes a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which basically resurrects, the notion of Atlantis. And not for nothing, it's also mainly influenced by Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So Verne, very briefly in his book, has the Nautilus visit Atlantis underwater. Donnelly runs with that and creates this, very extensive kind of imagined history of Atlantis influencing all these cultures around the world. He's drawing in things like the very recently charted undersea mid-Atlantic ridge to prove his points. He's bringing in anthropology of, South Americans, Middle Eastern peoples, Egypt, to tie this all together. When we think of, Atlantis today in modern pop culture, we're thinking of Donnelly's Atlantis. And really, his book was a runaway success. I mean, it was a major bestseller. He's writing about, he's exchanging letters, to Charles Darwin about Atlantis. He's exchanging letters to, members of the U.S. Congress, the British Parliament about this. So this is, such a runaway success. He says, I got to follow this up with something, fast. In less than 6 months, he writes another over 500-page book very quickly, and the quality kind of reflects that, called Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, where he kind of, continues on from the idea of Atlantis and says, maybe Atlantis was destroyed when a giant comet hit the Earth and, not only knocked out the civilization of Atlantis, but could have caused the extinctions at the end of the Ice Age. And so this is for the very first time we have the idea that comets can actually, not only hit the Earth, but also cause mass extinctions. Again, this doesn't quite line up, with things like how we imagine the dinosaurs today. This is almost a century before the idea, the Alvarez hypothesis, that an asteroid or comet impact killed off the dinosaurs. So again, even though, Donnelly was not right on any of this, the idea he's starting to propose of comets has kind of a lot, it's prescient in at least some ways. Now, 5 years after he writes Ragnarok, Donnelly publishes another book with, I'll say the full title here, The Great Cryptogram, Francis Bacon's Cipher in the So-Called Shakespeare Plays, which pioneers the idea that Shakespeare never existed and Francis Bacon was the real Shakespeare. One of the people who, because Atlantis was a runaway hit, Ragnarok didn't sell so well, so Donnelly needed a little help to publish this book. One of the people who is responsible for getting this book published is Mark Twain. And of course, near the end of his life, Mark Twain publishes Is Shakespeare Dead?, which is essentially he doesn't quite commit to the Baconian hypothesis, but it's essentially Mark Twain saying, I'm convinced that Shakespeare never existed. People at the time are saying, oh, Mark Twain, he's just carrying on Ignatius Donnelly's work. So again, even though, the Comet aspect of Donnelly's writings doesn't quite have that same, that direct resonance, we know Twain had interactions with Donnelly, was interested in his other works. There's, some people who said that Twain's Connecticut Yankee is very evocative of Donnelly's novel Caesar's Column, and I think there's also an argument to be made that a Connecticut Yankee kind of is a parallel to some of the social ideas of Atlantis that Donnelly invents. So again, a way in which Twain is reflecting some of these more out there notions of comets, as we might say. Now, Twain himself also, he wrote a few works about comets, not super well-known ones, but there are there. A Curious Pleasure Excursion, the first, was written in 1874, and this is reflecting a major development in astronomy at the time. In 1874, astronomers have invented a device called a spectroscope, which basically you can analyze the light coming from celestial bodies, divide the light into different spectrums, and through that you can see what the composition of these stars, planets, comets are. And so now you can start to examine what Mars, what Venus, what Jupiter are actually made out of. That year, 1874, there's a comet that comes by Comet Kagia. So for the first time, astronomers can look at a comet, analyze what it's made out of. They discover that Comet Kagia has a very trace amount of cyanogen in it, cyanogen being a poisonous gas. Now, this causes kind of a minor panic. It's not a really big one because the Earth isn't going to go through the tail of Kagia. It's not really an important point. But this is the first time that people start to worry about the impact of comets, so to speak, on life on Earth. That's not reflected in Mark Twain's story, but it does seem that he's influenced by the hubbub over Comet Kagia at the time. And it's mainly, you can say that because Comet Kagia is in the story itself. It's an interesting kind of satire of cruises. It's basically people advertising, space on the comet as a cruise liner, basically depicting the comet as a giant cruise ship. He says, the comet's going to leave from New York. We're going to, return to Earth in 1,000,000 years. Buy your tickets now. And notably in it, there's a possible reference to Hale, the author of The Brick Moon. There's a Mr. Hale of Maine who runs the comet's postal service. Seems to be a reference to Hale, the author. Now, there's also kind of a similar aspect of that in one of his later stories, Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven, where you have deceased people basically racing comets around, yacht racing. So again, an echo of that there. Interestingly, both of these are also very similar to Jules Verne's, not just Off on a Comet, but one of his later novels, Propeller Island, which is a very big satire of kind of an unrestrained American imperialism and capitalism. Essentially, a bunch of Americans, get tired of regulation in the U.S. and they create kind of like a giant mobile island to drive around the Pacific. There's a lot of echoes of that. I don't think Twain directly influenced that, but his comet stories have some interesting parallels there as well. The one in between, A Letter from the Comet, again, this is seemingly influenced by a comet that passed in 1881, discovered by the astronomer William Robert Brooks. It was named Brooks's Comet. Twain starts writing this short story as a letter from the comet protesting being named after the astronomer Brooks when the comet already has a name. He kind of crossed that out and wrote a different story where the comet is coming back to Earth and basically saying like, what happened to Adam? I used to see him all the time. I don't see him anymore. Where is he? And like Methuselah, Noah, just wondering where all these old people are. So not a direct connection to anything scientific, but an interesting parallel there as well. Now, the sources that Twain used for astronomy, we actually have a pretty good understanding of this because in the 1930s, his daughter Clara writes down like a big list of the science books that Twain used in particular. Among them, there are 4 astronomy books. So, in chronological order, we have The Heavens, an illustrated handbook of popular astronomy, written in 1867 by the French journalist and the popular science writer Amédée Guimont. The Pith of Astronomy Without Mathematics, the latest facts and figures as developed by the giant telescopes. That's written in 1896 by an Irish industrialist and amateur astronomer, Samuel G. Bain. In 1906, we have Sidelights on Astronomy and Kindred Fields of Popular Science by the Canadian-American astronomer Simon Newcomb. And then finally, in 1909, we have Curiosities of the Sky by the American science popularizer and actually a very prominent early science fiction author, Garrett P. Serviss, who was something kind of like the Carl Sagan or the Neil deGrasse Tyson of his time. So these are the 4 books that Clara says Mark Twain used a lot as references for astronomy. The problem being the last 2 are written very near the end of his life, so probably not as big an influence. Notably also, all of these except for the one by Newcomb, these are written by non-specialists. Newcomb is the only astronomer who wrote a book that Twain was using, which also might be a reflection of some of his astronomical understanding or misunderstanding in some parts. Now, I will say also, just today I was going through the Quarry Farm library. I did find another astronomy book there. It was Mary Evans Martin's The Friendly Stars. Now, unfortunately, probably this was not an influence on Twain because it's published in 1907 at Quarry Farm. Susan Crane makes an inscription inside it that she gets it in 1908. So that's after Mark Twain stops going to Quarry Farm. So that's an astronomy book he probably didn't read, at least not up here. But at least we know that someone in his family was reading that as an astronomy book. Now again, we come to 1910, the return of Halley's Comet. There's a lot going on in 1910. In January in the United Kingdom, there's an election that goes on, which today is completely forgotten. But in the UK at the time, this is seen as kind of a sign of is the country going to survive? Essentially because the Liberal Party that was in government at the time proposed a budget that was going to tax wealthy people a bit more. And so this was seen as something that could completely destroy British society. And so the election was a referendum on the liberal reform program. Again, something that's completely forgotten now, but seemed apocalyptic at the time. Then you have the fact that on the day of Halley's Comet's closest approach, King Edward VII dies. So again, this seems to play in with the association of comets as portents of disaster. And it's not just in the United Kingdom. In China, the appearance of Halley's Comet contributes to the political crisis that the next year leads to the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, the establishment of the Republic of China. But more than anything, the big panic that's happening in 1910 is, again, just like with Comet Kaja in 1874, astronomers can use spectroscopes to discover that Halley's Comet's tail contains traces of cyanogen in it. And not only does Halley's Comet's tail have cyanogen, the Earth will actually pass through the tail. This leads to, literally apocalyptic fear-mongering. If you read newspaper reports at the time, they are full of people, there's a story of, a man tries to sacrifice his daughter to appease the comet. one that's very wild, a guy crucifies himself. He creates a cross, he nails his feet, he nails one of his hands. When people show up and are like, what are you doing? He tries to get them to finish crucifying his other hand. I think they get him down from there. I mean, there are reports of people killing their families. There's reports of, again, people are basically building like comet bunkers in the bottom of coal mines. One thing that I saw this interesting report, I think it was from Tacoma. They were offering comet-proof bunkers, where basically they were saying this guy had built underground rooms that he was going to offer to people. You would go in them, he would pour 2 feet of concrete, against the door to seal you in and protect you from the comet gas. After 10 days, he would remove the concrete and you could come out. Now, the good news is that this was a free service he was offering. The bad news is there was a fee for him to actually remove the concrete. So the rooms were free, the unsealing was the charge. And also you have to wonder, the logistics of that, if, everyone was going to die on the surface, how are you going to, get, but thankfully, I think probably people offering this didn't really believe in it. And, a lot of these reports also, not, surprisingly, it's, immigrants from Eastern Europe, Mexican immigrants, Black people, people in Africa. It's a chance, for, to highlight a lot of, the quote superstition of, the quote primitive peoples of the world as well. But there's a lot of, hucksterism amongst, the respectable white community. One of my favorite things is people sold comet pills. And so, you would take these comet pills to protect you from the effects of cyanide, which you can only imagine what was probably in some of these pills. But interestingly, there's a large, people buy gas masks. There's lots of people stocking up on gas. There's the idea that, people are studying, what's the effect of poison gas on humans. This is 5 years before poison gas is first used in World War I. I do kind of wonder to what degree the fear over the gas panic of Halley's Comet plays into kind of the popular understanding of gas warfare, at least at the start of World War I. But there also are literary predecessors as well, a lot of which are influenced by that earlier minor panic. In 1909, M.P. Scheel has the novel The Purple Cloud. H.G. Wells's novel from 1906, In the Days of the Comet. His 1898 War of the Worlds, that's kind of the first time that poison gas warfare is used in fiction. And then the memory of this is kept up afterwards as well. Arthur Conan Doyle in 1913 has his novel The Poison Belt, which again has kind of like, a comet-proof room, just like a lot of the ones from the Halley's Comet panic. W.E.B. Du Bois has a 1920 short story, The Comet, which directly references the fears over Halley's Comet, but it's another comet comes, kills off everyone in New York City except a black man and a white woman. It's basically these two people, making their way across this post-apocalyptic New York City. And so you have, all of these panics emerging in the context of Halley's Comet, the fear over gas. In a lot of ways, again, this is the predecessor not only of the 1938 War of the Worlds panic and the radio broadcast, which again also involved poison gas being used. But again, if you go back to the end of the century, about 10 years after the next return of Halley's Comet, you have the Hale-Bopp panic in 1997, not to the same extent, but again, people committing suicide because they're afraid of what they see in the tail of this approaching comet, which didn't turn out to actually be a UFO. But again, it's kind of interesting. You do have, the 20th century kind of begins and ends with these two massive, comet-related hysteria. Now, to zoom out, not only, metaphorically, but literally as well, Twain himself is living in a period of really dramatic, changing understanding, not only of the Earth and its relation to the universe, but the structure of the universe. And I'll say in some cases, this is, really incorrect understanding is starting to be revised. The age of the Earth, the age of the universe is strongly being contested because people claim, that the Earth can only be a few thousand years old. And notably, it's not, religious fundamentalists claiming this, it's physicists, because again, even into the late 1890s, there's no knowledge of radioactivity. So there's no mechanism by which the heat of the Earth, and more importantly, the heat of the sun, can be understood except for chemical combustion. Physicists, calculate, if the sun is pure carbon burning in pure oxygen, there's only around 10,000 or so years the sun is going to be burning. If the Earth's heat, from volcanoes comes from the condensing of the Earth from the primeval solar nebula, there's only, a few thousand years that heat can be contained. So without the understanding of radioactivity, of nuclear reactions, it's the physicists who argue the Earth is only a few thousand years old. The Earth can only last, a few thousand years more. Very quickly, the Earth is going to be, turned into like this frozen wasteland of permanent darkness. So you have this kind of early stretch of I guess we would call it post-apocalyptic science fiction stories being published in the 1890s, the early 1910s. Lord Dunsany, Arthur Machen, both of whom are in the Mark Twain Society in the early 20th century, published some of these novels. William Hope Hodgson, H.G. Wells, who's also in the Mark Twain Society, The Time Machine, the end of The Time Machine, the very end, after the stuff with the Morlocks and the Eloi, the time traveler goes into the quote far future, which is a few million years. He arrives in the far future, and the sun has burned out, the Earth is frozen, and as pointed out in this illustration, it's giant crabs are the only surviving life on Earth. And so again, you have these popular notions of the future where the fear is not global warming, but global freezing. Now, by the start of the 20th century, radium is discovered, and that kind of unlocks a lot of the understanding. Interestingly, 1904, not one of his better-known stories, Mark Twain writes Sold to Satan, where he has this kind of little aside, and he talks about what if, there was an explosion of, radium and polonium, and the energy was unleashed and it destroyed the world. Now, it's not quite an atomic bomb, but he's one of the first people to kind of, speculate on what if radioactive elements have, ultimate destructive capability. Now, in that as well, we today have a fear of global warming, but more broadly, we know that the universe is expanding. And so ultimately, there will be kind of like an ultimate dark, frozen endlessness of the universe. The universe in Mark Twain's life was not expanding. Rather, it was, but it was not understood to be expanding. The expansion of the universe is proved by analyzing the redshift of stars only in 1922. The universe is also much smaller. The idea that what are called the great nebulas might actually be other galaxies, that's not proven until Edwin Hubble, the namesake of the Space Telescope, identifies the so-called Great Andromeda Nebula as a separate galaxy in 1925. So we have a static universe, we have a much smaller universe where the Milky Way is basically it, and we have a universe where, the Earth is going to die out in a few thousand years, maybe a million years at most. There's also, understandings of how the universe, kind of like the mechanics of the universe at a most fundamental level exist. Newtonian physics is still the cutting edge of physics for most of Twain's life. In 1887, the Michelson-Morley experiment seems to show that ether, this kind of mysterious element through which light and radiation and gravity was transmitted, that was hypothesized to fill the universe, seems to prove ether doesn't exist. This isn't really confirmed until the May 29th, 1919 solar eclipse, when observations of Mercury orbiting the sun can kind of confirm that there is a mechanic at work here, which is the special theory of relativity proposed by Albert Einstein. So Twain's lifetime is kind of this nether region where, on the one hand, the prevailing kind of Newtonian system seems to have severe flaws, but there's not really an understood or even widely accepted notion of the alternative to explain some of this. But there is quite a lot of new discoveries being made as well at this time. Twain lived, even if he doesn't see, the universe as expanding beyond the Milky Way, the understanding of the solar system dramatically accelerates during Twain's lifetime. The planet Neptune is discovered in 1846. Twain later on claims, he predicted the discovery of Neptune because he felt the gravitational perturbations. And Neptune is discovered by astronomers observing the orbit of the planet Uranus, finding kind of like wobbles in its orbit. They use gravity to calculate, okay, there must be another planet out there impacting Uranus. They look exactly where their calculations are, and they discover Neptune. Meanwhile, closer to home in Jupiter, in 1892, the first new moon of Jupiter since Galileo discovers the original four in 1610 is discovered. This is the moon Amalthea, discovered by that astronomer E. Bernard I mentioned at the start. There's also less successful searches for other planets. So this map here, this is from 1846. This is a map of the solar system by a man named Hall Colby. He was a self-educated farmer who lived in Rochester, New York. He was known for building, like very precise astronomical instruments, making these kind of, maps of the solar system. Again, despite the fact he had no formal education. But if you look, at the start here, we have, Earth, or Venus rather, Mercury, and then within Mercury, the planet Vulcan. And again, this is because just like the astronomers who observed the orbit of Uranus discovered it wasn't quite lining up, arguing there must be a planet whose gravity was impacting that, they find Neptune. Astronomers are observing the orbit of Mercury around the sun, finding its orbit doesn't quite match up with what's predicted. Therefore, there must be a planet even closer to the sun, Vulcan. The reality is that, again, Mercury is orbiting so close to the sun that the huge gravity of the sun kind of breaks down Newtonian physics. You have to use Einstein's theory of relativity. That explains the orbit of Mercury, the wobbles. Because that's not understood at the time, people assume there must be this innermost planet, Vulcan, that's there. And throughout the 19th century, you have people claiming to observe Vulcan. You also have kind of like a subgenre of kind of, like hucksters who say, like, by using the orbit of Mercury, you can predict the weather. And I have the special Vulcan almanac that has, the orbits of, Vulcan proving, what storms are going to happen when. So buy my almanac, and, probably as successful as any other almanac in that respect. Now, a bit further out, there's also the idea that the asteroid belt, which is only first observed in the year 1801. So again, it's very early in the 19th century. So the asteroids themselves, a discovery of the 19th century. The prevailing theory is that the planet, the asteroids are a remnant of a planet that exploded. This hypothetical planet is referred to as Phaeton. That idea, kind of gets dismissed later on. But even so, there are people looking for remnants of Phaeton, kind of like the core of this exploded planet in the asteroid belt. Today we just know it's because of the gravity of Jupiter that it never really condensed together. And then we have, near the end of the 19th century, the search for Planet X, as it was termed. And despite, the Roman numeral, Planet X just refers to unknown. This is again because people who are observing the orbit of Neptune seem to find that it is wobbling in unexpected ways. That later on gets explained in other ways, probably incorrect observations in the orbits of its moons around Neptune. But people argue there must be a hidden planet beyond Neptune, a ninth planet out there. And so Mark Twain, near the end of his life, is very interested in the search for this ninth planet, this Planet X. One of the last things he writes is in November 1909. He writes in Harper's Weekly a letter called an article called "The New Planet," where he's endorsing the idea of the astronomer William Henry Pickering that the ninth planet has been observed. Twain and his biographer Albert Bigelow Paine discuss the mysterious ninth planet all throughout 1909. So really the last year of his life, Twain is really interested in the search for Planet X. And at the time of his death, Planet X remains undiscovered. But the search for Planet X is so popular at the time in the early 20th century because it's a spin-off of, we'll say, a different astronomical adventure that was being undertaken in the late 19th century. And this is the search for life on Mars. In 1877, an Italian astronomer, Giovanni Schiaparelli, announces he has, observed Mars through his telescope and discovered what he calls canali on Mars, by which he meant channels. Basically, he thought that the Martian ice caps were melting, creating these runoff channels. He thinks he's observing them. He announces this. His word gets translated into English as not channel, but canal, which has the connotation of an artificial construction. Again, the late 19th century, this is a period of massive canal construction. So canals are on people's minds across the world. So all of a sudden, people go crazy, say, if people are building canals on Mars, there must be Martians building canals. People are, proposing, maybe we can, build, these Pythagorean shapes in the Sahara Desert, fill them with kerosene, light them on fire, and, use mathematical symbols to communicate with the Martians. Nikola Tesla announces, he built a radio set and claims he's picking up transmissions from Mars, which probably were just actually radio signals from the electrical belt around Jupiter. So again, these kind of modern notions of using radio to communicate with aliens, that's from the 19th century. It's not 20th, it's not 21st, that's a firmly Victorian notion. But quickly, Schiaparelli kind of steps away from this debate. Interestingly, he does kind of later on say, well, if there are Martians that exist, the only way, a Martian government could create planetary canals is through, a socialist utopia. So he has an article where he says, the existence of canals on Mars would prove socialism exists and is possible, which is also, again, kind of a different view from a lot of people interested in space exploration today will say. But the leading figure proposing, Martian canals, decidedly non-socialist, Percival Lowell, one of the Lowell family of Boston, the brother of the president of Harvard University. Lowell was this kind of a dilettante. He was kind of like an ambassador for hire in Korea. He was this Orientalist, amateur guy who wrote a lot about the nature of Buddhism and Shintoism. He hears about Schiaparelli. He kind of drops all the interest in Asian religions. He becomes a Mars guy. So using his using his huge family wealth, his interest in Mars, in Flagstaff, Arizona, he builds Lowell Observatory in 1894, and he studies Mars. Eventually, by the start of the 20th century, the idea that there are canals on Mars, that Mars can sustain advanced life, that kind of gets dropped very quickly. Lowell also makes some questionable claims about observing aliens on Venus that metaphorically get him laughed out of the room. Lowell basically says, okay, people don't take my Mars stuff seriously. I'm going to rehabilitate my scientific acumen. I'm going to use Flagstaff Observatory, or Lowell Observatory rather, not for looking at Mars. We're going to find Planet X here. And so Lowell Observatory is the center of the Planet X program. Now, Lowell dies in 1916. There's this big dispute with his family, with other members of the observatory staff that basically make the search for Planet X gets put on pause for a long time. 1929, it gets restarted. Almost immediately, the new astronomer at Lowell Observatory, Clyde Tombaugh, he discovers Pluto again. So again, this is seen as Planet X. Eventually, it's revised on Pluto is not this missing planet. Pluto is much too small to have any gravitational effect on Neptune. It's a complete coincidence that Clyde Tombaugh actually did discover Pluto because, again, it shouldn't be there. It has no connection to the estimates. But it is true, Percival Lowell, wanted to rehabilitate himself by using his observatory to find a new planet, and it did pay off, later on. Now, I haven't found any reference by Mark Twain to Percival Lowell or even to Martians thus far, which seems odd. This seems like something to be right up Mark Twain's alley, but again, maybe I'll stumble across something at some point. Now, the last kind of a big event of the 19th century, start of the 20th century I'll talk about is, again, something related with aliens, something much more modern. That's something that's in the news all the time today, and that is, the UFO, or UAP as you have to call them now. We talk about, UFOs as starting, in 1947. You have the Kenneth Arnold sighting, you have the Roswell crash. As it turns out, UFOs have been, people have been seeing things in the sky, or rather, claiming they've seen things in the sky since the 19th century. And even ideas like, UFO crashes, dead aliens, secret burials, government cover-ups. This has been going on for decades before the modern UFO wave starts. And this actually, kind of the first wave is what's called the phantom airship wave of 1896 to 97, when people across the West and the Southwest see these mysterious flying machines in the sky. Notably, for the most part, this is not associated with aliens. People think that these are some eccentric inventor built this flying machine, is flying it around the U.S., but you do have occasional sightings in this year-long wave of claiming that these are actually Martians. And probably the most famous one, you see this on the left here, this is the cemetery of Aurora, Texas, where in 1897, again, almost exactly 50 years before Roswell, the people in the town claim that a Martian spaceship crashes. The Martian pilot kind of stumbles out and dies. They claim that they bury the Martian in the town cemetery. The U.S. Army shows up and kind of covers everything up. Again, 50 years before Roswell, you have the exact. They're just not calling it a UFO. Again, later on, it comes that this is a sleepy, dying town. The newspaper, is looking for stories to sell issues, and probably this is all made up. A lot of these stories are probably made up because journalistic standards are not quite what they are today. I mean, this is almost the exact same time that you have, yellow journalism starting the Spanish-American War. That seems to be widely recognized, but also, people don't seem to really connect that with, these stories about UFOs that are occurring in the 1890s. But then again, a few years later, 1909, late 1909, early 1910, there's another airship panic, as it's referred to in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut. This is associated with a businessman named Wallace Tillinghast from Worcester, Massachusetts, who claims that he's invented a flying machine and he's been flying it around, southern New England. People, will see, like, oh, look, up in the sky, it's, the Tillinghast airship and pointing up, and people say, that's actually just the planet Venus. Again, because this guy was claiming he had this amazing airship, people see, bright stars, bright planets in the sky, and just jump to airship. And ultimately, the Tillinghast airship is proven to be a hoax, because one of the nights when people claim to see it, he's, just at home hanging out, and kind of hard to keep that, pretense. Also, he's just some guy, some random businessman, he can't really show off his airship, so it doesn't go anywhere. But again, I do have to actually, of course, end by mentioning one other encounter that Mark Twain did have with aliens. And this is when he's in San Francisco in the year 1893, and he encounters the crew of the USS Enterprise who've traveled back in time from the year 2368. He does go into the future. He did see several alien crew members on the Enterprise crew, and Data the droid as well, and before they send him back to the past. And so that is one encounter that he has. And I should point out also that William Shatner does play Mark Twain in an episode of the TV show Murdoch Mysteries. And so, it's almost an hour. So, with Star Trek, I'll end that here and just say, I'm happy to answer any questions. And hopefully this was of some interest, at least.